In the last section, we started talking about the overall architecture of the app that we're going to put together. Again, can't say it enough, way more complicated than it needs to be, just so we have multiple containers to work with. So in this section, we're going to start putting together the source code for the entire application. A quick note here, in this section and the next couple of videos, we're going to be putting together the JavaScript side of the application. We're not going to touch any Docker stuff for right now. So no Docker files, no Docker Compose, no Travis, no deployment, nothing like that. The reason that we're going to focus just on the JavaScript side for right now is that if you do not care about all this JavaScript stuff, like you don't care about React, you don't care about Express, you don't care about any of that stuff, totally fine. You can skip this video and the next couple, you can move on to the next section. And in that section, I'm going to post all the code that we're going to write right now up for download. So if you don't care about JavaScript stuff at all, totally fine, pause the video here and skip ahead a couple of videos. I want to make sure that if you are not a JavaScript person, you don't have to sit through all this stuff. And I'm only showing how to put the application together from scratch in case you are a JavaScript person and you're kind of curious about how to work with Redis and set up this kind of like worker over here and Postgres and Redis and all that kind of other good stuff. So again, if you don't care about the JavaScript stuff, pause here, skip forward a couple of videos. Otherwise, we're going to get started right now. Okay, so the first thing we're going to put together is this worker process. Remember, the worker process is going to watch Redis for any new indices that get inserted. Anytime the worker sees a new index added to Redis, it's going to pull that index and then calculate the appropriate Fibonacci value for it. Now, as we put this worker together, I'm not going to tell you too much about the behind the scenes stuff, like specifically how we work with Redis from JavaScript code, because that's not really the goal of this course. But I will give you just a little bit of commentary to make sure you have the general idea of what's going on. So let's get to it. I'm going to first begin by changing on over to my terminal. You'll notice that I'm back in a workspace directory of sorts, so I'm no longer inside of any of the folders that we've been working on so far. I'm going to make a new folder inside of here called complex. And the idea behind this is that the name of our application will be kind of like a more complex application. I'm then going to change into that folder. And then inside of here, I'm going to make another folder that's going to house all of the source code for this kind of worker process that's going to calculate the actual Fibonacci values. So I'll make a new folder inside of here called worker. And then finally, I'm going to start up my code editor inside of the complex directory. All right. So here's the worker folder that we just created. I'm going to first begin by adding a package.json file to it. So inside the worker directory, I'll make a package.json file. Then inside of here, we'll put down a little bit of configuration. We're going to add in a couple of dependencies that we're going to need. The first dependency that I'm going to want is nodemon, which is going to give us some live reload of code anytime that we change the source of our project. We'll go more into that a little bit later. The version of nodemon that I'm going to get is 1.18.3. I'm also going to get a Redis client that will allow us to connect to a copy of Redis and pull values out of it and do all the stuff that we need to do with Redis. And for that, I'm going to get version 2.8.0, like so. Now at this point, please make sure that you're keeping track of the code that I'm typing and the code you're typing. Please double check for typos and whatnot, because we're not going to run any of this code for several sections. So if you make a typo in here, it's going to be kind of challenging to come back later on and find where you made that typo. So for example, make sure you get the comma at the end of the nodemon line. Make sure you do not have a comma at the end of the Redis line, and so on. So now we're going to also put a script section in here as well. I'm going to add a comma at the end of dependencies. And I'll put in scripts. And then we're going to add on a start script of node index.js. And I'll do a dev script of simply nodemon, like so. All right, so that's it for our package.json file. Again, please double check the placement of your commas. Please make sure that you're using double quotes everywhere inside of here, and both all the keys and all the values should have double quotes around them as well. So that's all we need for package.json. I'm now going to create a separate file inside of here called index.js. So this is where we're going to put all of our primary logic for connecting to Redis, watching for values, and then eventually calculating our Fibonacci value. all the configuration or kind of keys that we're going to need for connecting over to Redis are going to be stored inside of a separate file. So the first thing I'm going to do inside of here is require in a file that we're going to call keys. And again, this file is going to house the host name and the port required for connecting over to Redis. So inside of the worker folder, I'm going to make another file called keys.js. And inside of here, we're going to add in a module.exports that's going to be an object that's going to have a Redis host of process.env Redis host and a Redis port of process.env Redis port. So anytime that we want to connect to Redis, we're going to look for the host name, or essentially URL of sorts for Redis, and the port that we're supposed to connect to it from our environment variables. So when we run this application, we darn sure better well have a Redis host environment variable and a Redis port environment variable defined as well. So that's all we have to put inside the keys file. I'm going to go back over to index.js. And then inside of here, now that we've got our API keys, or essentially just connection keys, I should call it, put together, we're going to start putting together the logic to get a connection over to our Redis server. So I'm going to first import a Redis client. We'll then create a Redis client. And to this thing, we're going to pass an object that has a host of keys.redishost, a port of keys.redisport, and then we're going to add on one other little option in here called retry underscore strategy. And this is going to tell the Redis client that we're using right here that if it ever loses connection to our Redis server, it should attempt to automatically reconnect to the server once every 1 second, or once every 1,000 milliseconds. After that, we're going to make a duplicate of the Redis client that we just put together. We'll talk about why we're doing that in just a moment. So I'll say const sub is Redis client dot duplicate like so. All right. After that, we'll then put together the function that's going to be actually used for calculating these Fibonacci values given some particular index. So the work function, we'll say function fib, will be called with some index. We're going to say if index is ever less than 2, then we're going to return the value 1. Otherwise, we're going to return fib index minus 1 plus fib index minus 2. This right here is a very classic solution to the Fibonacci sequence. It's going to return the value 1 if the index submitted is ever less than 2. Otherwise, it's going to take the previous two values, add them together, and then return that. Now, we could talk for days about exactly how this solution right here works. If you want to, you could always go look at a blog post or two to get a better idea about the Fibonacci recursive solution. Now, we're very purposefully using a recursive solution right here because it's very slow, and it's going to give us kind of a better reason for making use of Redis and having a separate worker process to calculate these Fibonacci values. So this is not an ideal solution right here, but it's one that kind of simulates why we would want to have a separate worker process. Now, the last thing that we need to do inside of here, we're going to use the Redis client connection that we just put together. We're going to watch Redis for any time we get a new value inserted into it, and anytime we see a new value, we're going to run our fib function that we just put together. So we'll say sub, which remember is the duplicate client right here. Sub stands for subscription, because we're going to watch Redis and get a message anytime that a new value shows up. I'll say sub.on message. So anytime that we get a new message, run this callback function that we're going to add right here. The callback function will be called with something called a channel and a message. We'll then say Redis client.hset values message, and then finally we're going to calculate the actual Fibonacci value by saying fib parse int and message, like so. And let me zoom out so you can see that whole line. So anytime that we get a new value that shows up in Redis, we're going to calculate a new Fibonacci value, and then insert that into a hash of values, or a hash called values. The key will be the index that we received. So message right here is going to be the index value that was submitted into our form. And then we push in the value for Fibonacci sequence that we just calculated as well. And then the last thing that we're going to do inside this file, we'll say sub.subscribe to any insert event. So anytime someone inserts a new value into Redis, we're going to get that value and attempt to calculate the Fibonacci value for it, and then toss that value back into the Redis instance. All right, so like I said, we're going very light on detail right now because this is super off topic related to or compared to the actual Docker stuff that we're trying to talk about. The very last thing I want to do is I want to try to run this index.js file. The file's not going to run successfully, but it should at least tell us whether or not you have a typo in here. So back at my terminal, I'm going to change into that worker directory. And then inside of here, I'm going to execute node index.js. Now, if you see a message right here that says cannot find module Redis, that's good. That's what we want to see. If you made a typo somewhere in here, like let's say I have an extra colon or 3 on this line right here, and then I try to run node index.js, I'll see a different message. I'll see something that says, hey, you made a typo. So if you see anything other than cannot find module Redis, that means that you made a typo somewhere and you need to double check and find that typo in your code and fix it. All right, so that's it for the worker process. Let's take a quick pause right here and we'll continue in the next section.